I'm Hanan Schlesinger. About 90 or 95% of you have been on these calls before and know who I am. You know a little bit about Shorashim, about Roots, the Israeli-Palestinian Grassroots Initiative for Understanding Nonviolence and Transformation. Let me say that this event is a little bit different than most of our other Sunday events, because in this event, we're not talking about peace building, people to people peace building, neither about the theory of it or about the practicality of it. In this event, we are going into, let's say, the depths of Jewish theology and Jewish practice to try and see how it moves forward or moves backwards the matters of building bridges of understanding between different types and different groups of human beings. Shorashim, Roots, of course, brings together Jews, Christians, and Muslims and other groups as well. But I'm Jewish, and my particular concern, my particular personal concern, is the role, the positive and or negative role of Jewish practice and Jewish theology in moving us forward towards a world of human understanding between different groups and different religions. So those of you who aren't Jewish or aren't connected to Jewish practice, this call, this event is certainly relevant to you, but you may be missing some of the background. So if you need to ask a question and stop me, please do that. And I'm open to it. Okay. The topic, we said, is from a Passover of alienation to a Passover of empathy. We're dealing with this topic now, of course, because the Jews know that Passover is upon us. Another 6 days, 7 days actually. Saturday night begins Passover, the 7-day holiday, in Hebrew, Pesach. I want to begin with the following. I believe, I've read somewhere, that other than the Bible, Hebrew scripture, the most commented upon and the most reprinted and the most studied Jewish text is the Passover Haggadah, the pamphlet, the manual that we use to conduct the ceremony, the family ceremony of Leil HaSeder, of Seder night. This Saturday night, Jews will be sitting down, in most cases, with family, friends, to conduct a family-based ritual that is the centerpiece of the Passover holiday. And this is probably, this Passover Seder is one of the major ways that we Jews pass on our experiences, our theology, our beliefs to our families and to the next generation. And I'm going to make, in the coming hour and a half, the rather audacious claim that there's something wrong with the way we Jews celebrate our Seder, celebrate our ritual meal for Passover, the Seder. Of course, I'm not going to claim that everything is wrong with it, but I'm going to claim that part of what we say, what we do, let's say 10%, 15%, is misguided. And I'll give you a thumbnail overview of the direction that I'm going to go in. I'm going to claim that the ritual that we conduct at the Seder, at this family event, was written, constructed, and designed for a period in which the Jewish people are politically powerless. And I'm secondly going to claim that the true meaning of the Passover holiday and the true content of what we should be passing on in this ceremony can only really be appreciated and practiced by a Jewish people that has political power. Today, the Jewish people has political power in the state of Israel. And therefore, I think that we have the opportunity to go back and really uncover, to pass on and to inculcate within ourselves the true meaning of Passover that's been lost for the past 2,000 years. Furthermore, it's not only in the state of Israel today that Jews have political power. It's also in the US and in some other Western countries, but especially in the US. that the Jewish people are not persecuted. They're not a persecuted minority anymore in the US. They have a certain degree of political power. Their voice is heard. And I think, therefore, that it's time not just for Israeli Jews, but for American Jews to re-examine the Seder ritual. And I hope to show that the way we conduct that ritual today is for a people in exile, a people that's a persecuted minority that is not able to fully appreciate and apply the insights and lessons of Passover. And it's time to leave that behind and to move on to what the holiday really was meant to mean when it was recorded and given us in the Torah thousands of years ago. That's a thumbnail. It's not meant to be understandable. It's just meant to be a guidepost for what we're about to do. Here we go. I assume that most of you have been sent 2 source sheets, but in case you don't have them in front of you, I'm going to share my screen, and I will do that screen sharing right now. Okay. Okay, so you should have now a sheet that I'm going to have to make a little bit smaller. Here we go. I'm sorry, we'll have to do this a little bit. We'll have to do this again. Here we go. Okay, now you should have it. From a Passover of alienation to a Passover of empathy. What we're going to do is we're going to try to look at verses in the Torah and Hebrew scripture in the 5 books of Moses that describe to us what the Passover holiday is about. Now, most of us know, the Jews know, that the holiday is on the surface about the experience of slavery in Egypt and the experience of being redeemed from slavery in Egypt. That's what we're remembering. That's what we're passing on. That's what we're talking about. The question I want to ask is, why is that important? Why did the Jewish people want to pass on that memory? The memory of slavery and the memory of freedom? And the answer, I think, is quite clear in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses. It's written black and white in many, 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 many places. When I say many places, I mean specifically 36 places. The Talmud, the major text of rabbinic law, says that in 36 places, the Torah warns us to be solicitous, to be careful with the honor and respect showed a stranger. That matter of respect for the stranger, we're going to see, according to the Torah, is the essence of Passover. What I mean to say is that we remember our experiences in Egypt in order to know how to behave towards the other that we were when we were there in Egypt.
Rabbi, can I ask you a question about the Hebrew word ger?
I was right now. That's exactly what I was going to talk about. I just want to say that when the Talmud says that in 36 places we are warned about the honor and the respect due to a stranger, the truth is, if you go and count them, there's many more than 36 mentions of the stranger and how to behave towards him. If you try and take specific commandments, it comes to much less than 36. So it's not clear how our rabbis 2,000 years ago counted the 36, but it's clear that they meant to say that that's a major, major subject in the Torah. Now, Morris asked the question, What is a stranger? So I would like to actually spend a minute on that. Thank you, Morris. The word in Hebrew is ger. And in the sources we're about to see, I translated that word into English as sojourner. Sojourner, in other words, the Hebrew word means someone who stays for a while in a foreign place. I'll make it clear that there are a number of different words for other, for stranger in the Torah. One of them is nochri, which means foreigner. We're not talking about the foreigner. The foreigner is someone who's here today, gone tomorrow. A businessman, someone who's just passing through. The matters we're about to see are not about the foreigner, about the nochri. They're about the ger, the sojourner. And I think stranger is a good translation. Sojourner or stranger, as long as we remember that it's not every stranger. It's not the foreigner who's here today, gone tomorrow. It's a stranger who stays in our land for a certain amount of time. And of course, the quintessential ger, sojourner, stranger, is the Israelites in Egypt over 3,000 years ago. What they were, their status in the society, is what a ger, a sojourner, stranger is. It's someone who is in a foreign land. He's missing his family scenery. He's missing his support system. But he stays for a while, and he becomes to a certain degree acculturated, assimilated into the society. He's an insider, outsider, not a complete outsider, but not fully an insider. That's the word ger, again, sojourner, stranger. So here we go. And with all those introductions, we're finally beginning. The first source that you see is Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 9. And it says, do not abhor an Egyptian, for you were a ger, a sojourner in his land. Now we have to think about that for a minute. We are accustomed to the story from the Torah that we Jews, we Israelites, we were slaves in Egypt. We were slaves in Egypt. What do you mean that we were sojourners in Egypt, like this verse says? So probably what's going on is that this verse is reminding us that before we were slaves in Egypt, we were sojourners in Egypt. The truth is that at the end of the book of Genesis, we were invited into Egypt by the Pharaoh. We were given good land to live in. The 70 sons, Jacob and his 70 family members. We spent a number of years, decades upon decades upon decades, as sojourners there. We had it pretty good. Later, we were turned into slaves, as we'll talk about later. This verse is telling us that even though we later became slaves, don't forget that before we were slaves, we were sojourners in land. And we have to remember the good that we received from the Egyptians. Do not abhor an Egyptian, despite the fact that they made you slaves later. They first accepted you with open arms. You were sojourning in this land, you should appreciate it. And therefore, there's this commandment not to abhor an Egyptian. Okay, that's point number one. Point number two are these verses from Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 19 to 22. I'll just read them. When you reap the harvest in your field and overlook a sheaf in the field, do not turn back to get it. It shall go to the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, in order that the Lord your God may bless you in all your undertakings. When you beat down the fruit of your olive trees, do not go over them again. That shall go to the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, do not pick it all over again. That shall go to the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. Always remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, do I enjoin you to observe this commandment. Let's try and understand. So there are three different descriptions here. There's the harvesting of grain in the field. There's the harvesting of the olive trees. There's the harvesting of the grapes. And all these three cases, you go through the field and you harvest. Don't go back a second time. What you missed the first time, leave. Leave for who? Leave for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. That's what we call gleanings. Now, I understand that you should leave the gleanings in the field for the fatherless and the widow. They are your people. They're your families. They're your tribe. They're your religion. They're your ethnic group. They don't have land. They're not able to support themselves. This is charity. Let them work for themselves in the field and take what you have not picked up, what you have not harvested. But the verses 3 times say it's not just the fatherless and the widow, it's also the sojourner, who's not of your tribe, he's not of your kin, he's come from far away, he's lived in your land for a while, but he's not one of you. He's an other. He's a consummate other. And the verses say that you have to have compassion for the other, the outsider. It gives a reason for that in verse 22. Always remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, that's the reason I enjoin you to observe this commandment. It doesn't explicitly explain what it's talking about, but we'll have to figure it out. Apparently, and later verses will make this even clearer, you were a slave in Egypt. You know what it feels like to be an outsider, to be downtrodden, to not have the means to support yourself. Therefore, you should have the empathy to be able to understand the other, to put yourself in the shoes of the other. The fatherless, the widow, and specifically the sojourner. In Egypt, you weren't the fatherless, you weren't a widow, but you were an outsider. And this should give you the ability to put yourself in the shoes and the boots of the outsider, of the sojourner, and have more empathy for him than was shown towards you when you were there in Egypt. That seems to be what the verse is talking about. It's about developing empathy for the other because you were in his place. It's about acquiring the ability to put yourself in the shoes of the other, to feel what he feels because you were once him. And what I would learn from this is that the reason, or at least one of the reasons, why the Jewish people were slaves in Egypt, and why the Jewish people later were reminded in Torah again and again, remember you were slaves, remember, pass it on, never forget that you were slaves in Egypt. Why? Because of this. Exactly what we saw right here. And this will be fleshed out in further verses. We go now to Deuteronomy chapter 22. It says, and you shall not mistreat a sojourner. Then the same word ger, nor shall you oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. Here it's even more explicit. It's not that you were a slave in Egypt, therefore have empathy for the sojourner. That may be difficult to understand. It's two different words, slave and sojourner. Here it's the same word. Do not mistreat the sojourner because you were sojourners. It's clear that we're being told you should understand how he feels. You should understand his lack of security. You should understand his pain, his suffering. You should understand his hunger. You should understand his vulnerability because you were there. You were like him. Remember what it's like. Let me stop for a minute and take questions or comments because I'm sharing my screen. I can't see all of you on my own screen, but if anyone would like to just shout out, if you have a question relevant to what we just saw right now, please do so.
Rabbi, in some cases, the Art Scroll translates the word as proselyte.
Right. So that's a whole nother subject. I'll deal with it briefly. Thank you for bringing it up. In later Jewish tradition, I mean, after the Torah, some of the places where sojourner is mentioned, it's taken to be a proselyte, a convert to Judaism. In some places, yes, in some places, no. The simple meaning, in my opinion, of what we've read right now is clearly that it's not a proselyte. How do I know? Because we weren't converts to Egyptian religion. In other words, there's a parallel here between the verse or the idea, do not mistreat a sojourner on the one hand, and you were sojourners in Egypt. Which sojourner is it? It's the sojourner that you were in Egypt. Since we weren't converts to Egyptian religion, then it probably doesn't relate to someone who's a convert to the Jewish religion. It relates to someone who's in the situation that you were in 3,000 years ago.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Rabbi, I'm wondering whether I might suggest, and forgive me if I'm being too presumptuous, but even when we were enslaved, we were sojourners, because enslavement suggests everything we did in terms of hard labor. But being a sojourner suggests that, to me at least, that is the part of our humanity that we were able to retain for our own, and which we carried forth when we were liberated. So I don't know whether that idea of still being a sojourner, even during our times of enslavement, is supported by the text. But that's an idea that I am putting forth to you, which you can refute or otherwise. Thank you, Rabbi.
I'm not going to refute. I think that's important to put that on the table. And I will just leave it there on the table. Thank you.
Rabbi Hanan?
Yes.
And doesn't the Bible say, in fact, when Jacob and his children originally went down and they sojourned in Egypt, right in the very beginning, when the Israelites first went down to Egypt, and it said they sojourned there?
Yes, that's very true. Yes, absolutely. Yes, yes. What it says here, that you were sojourners, land of Egypt, is echoing exactly what the text says we were when we were there, that we were sojourners at the end of the book of Genesis, when the family of Jacob and his 70 extended family members went there. They went down to sojourn, and they did sojourn there, and that's the word used. Absolutely. Okay, going on to Leviticus chapter 19, should be at the bottom of your screen. When a sojourner sojourns with you in your land, you shall not oppress him. The sojourner who sojourns with you shall be as a native from among you. You shall love him as yourself, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. It's pretty explicit here that you should behave kindly, respectfully towards him, because you were in his shoes when you were in the land of Egypt. You know what it feels like. And here it goes so far as to say you should love him as yourself. Here I'm going to say something that may startle some of you, even perhaps get you up in arms, but I'm sorry about that. The Torah says in the book of Leviticus, not what we just read, but someplace else, in the same chapter actually, it says you should love your neighbor as yourself. Everyone knows that. Love your neighbor as yourself. In Hebrew, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Now, the truth is, it's clear, it's pretty clear in context that when it says you should love your neighbor as yourself, it doesn't say you should love every man. It says you should love your neighbor. Neighbor is the English translation of reacha, your colleague, your neighbor, in Hebrew, it means the fellow who is similar to you. And it could very well be that the simple meaning of the verse is that you have to love only your fellow Israelites. That's probably the simple meaning of the verse. It doesn't say love every man, it says love your neighbor. But the verse we're looking at right now extends that to the sojourner. In other words, there's two separate commandments. One is love those who are like you. And now this verse says love those who are not like you. It's two separate categories. It comes out, of course, practically you have to love both of them, but it's divided into two separate categories. It's relatively easy to love people who are like you. Your co-religionist, your ethnic group, or whatever it might be, your same nationality, because he or she is like you. But here it says you should also love those who are not like you, and a reason is given. Let me see, not a reason, but a way that you can help yourself to fulfill this idea of loving the other who's not like you, because you were in his shoes once and you remember what it's like. So the same point I am hitting you over the head with again and again and again, that the Jewish people were sojourners in Egypt. And the Torah asks us to remember that we're sojourners in Egypt, And the reason that we were sojourners in Egypt, and the reason we're supposed to remember it, is in order that we remember what it's like to be a sojourner, so that we will behave well towards the sojourner who lives in our midst in later time. Deuteronomy chapter 10. For the Lord your God is God of gods and the Lord of the lords, the great, mighty, and awesome God who will show no favor, nor will he take a bribe. He executes the judgment of the orphan and the widow, and he loves the sojourner to give him bread and clothing. You shall love the sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. So this verse goes very far. It gives you actually two reasons or two foundations or two motivations to love the sojourner. Number one, you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You know what it's like. You experienced it. You can have empathy because you were there. And if that's not enough, love the sojourner because God loves the sojourner. You should do what God does. You could even say that the Jewish people were given the experience of being sojourners in Egypt so that we'd be better able to be like God. God loves the sojourner. It's probably not difficult for him. For us, it's hard to love the sojourner. So God gave us the experience of being sojourners, being outsiders, suffering, being downtrodden, so that we would have the wells of empathy to be able to, like God, to love the sojourner. And now Exodus chapter 23. And you shall not oppress a sojourner. We've seen that earlier. For you know the feelings of the sojourner, since you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. Well, we just saw right now the words for you know the feelings of the sojourner. In Hebrew, it's kiadata et nefesh ager, literally because you know the soul of the sojourner. That's an idea that I have said already 20 times in this presentation, but it was never explicit in the text. Now it's explicit in the text. The idea of empathy is here explicit where earlier was only implicit, where you know the feelings of the sojourner because you were there. Then it goes on to say, 6 years you may sow your land and gather in its produce. In the 7th year you shall release it and abandon the poor of your people shall eat of it. What they leave over the beasts of the field shall eat, so shall you do to your vineyard and your olive trees. That's similar to what we saw earlier, but when you harvest, you should leave over. I'm sorry, I didn't say it correctly, that whatever you leave over, you should not go back again and take, but leave it for the poor and for the orphans, the widow, and the sojourner. So now we have the idea of the 7th year, that once a year, you don't gather in at all. Just leave the land fallow for the whole year, and it's for the poor of your people. But we're not finished. It's not just for the poor of your people. It goes on to say, 6 days you may do your work, but on the 7th day you shall rest, in order that your ox and your donkey shall rest, and your maidservant's son and the sojourner shall be refreshed. I want us to look carefully at this verse. 6 days you may do your work, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, you shall rest, in order. That's not a mistranslation. The Hebrew says in order. Which, why do you rest on the 7th day, according to this set of verses? In order that your ox and your donkey shall rest, and your maidservant's son and the sojourner. Why do you have to rest on Sabbath? So that you won't be in the field in order to give the sojourner work. The assumption is the sojourner has no land, no means of livelihood. He's a hired hand. He works for you. The Jewish people in the land of Israel, they have land. Everyone works on their own farm. The sojourner doesn't have his own land, doesn't have any means of livelihood. He's a hired hand. Why does the Torah say, according to these verses, there are other verses that say differently, according to these verses, why do you rest on the Sabbath day? Because that way you won't be able to force the sojourner to work. Your rest is just for him. What a radical idea. You rest just so he can rest. Just so he won't be forced to work, we make you not work. And as far as I'm concerned, this connects to everything we've seen until now. Verse 9, for example, here in chapter 23 of Exodus, you know the feelings of the sojourner. And therefore you'll understand when we tell you, don't work on the 7th day so that your sojourner won't work. You understand. You have empathy. You were in his shoes. You know what it's like. As we move now into Deuteronomy chapter 25, I'll stop again and open the floor up for comments and questions.
Rob? I was impressed and noticed the order of things. First, we're commanded to love the fellow, as if the first step is to get outside yourself. Then we're commanded to love the stranger. And only then, after those two, are we commanded to love the Lord your God, as if loving the Lord your God is dependent on the previous two.
You caught me off guard. I don't know what to say. So I'll just leave that as a point for thought. Thank you, Morris. Gilda, do you want to add something?
Yes, I do. When I read the Haggadah, for me, the story is from slavery to freedom. When you use the word sojourner, I understand that it's not a common usage in our vocabulary, but it seems clearly to be a common usage in our Bible. So how, if we change the sojourner to the word slave, everything you've just read has a totally different slant, a totally different feel.
So it's not slave, it's sojourner, but we can ask the question, Gilda,
Yes.
and give, I think, a clear answer. Who is today's sojourner? Well, it's clear. In America, today's sojourner are migrant workers. Today's sojourner are undocumented immigrants. In Israel, who are the sojourners? They're at least the Eritrean workers. They're the workers from Thailand. And I would claim that the Palestinians are also our sojourners, our other.
So how come there is so little emphasis or so little discussion of slavery?
Well, wait, there's more verses. We haven't finished yet.
Okay. I know you're going to tell me, I know you're going to explain it. I'm just a little impatient right now.
Okay, we have some noise here. Can you guys all mute yourselves? Everyone try and mute themselves, please. Okay, very good. That's better. The verses we're going to see now, you can see I separated them from the verses that came afterwards with a dotted line because they expressed a different idea, as we're about to see. Deuteronomy chapter 5. Keep the Sabbath day to sanctify it, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall work and do all creative labor. But the 7 days of Sabbath, Lord your God, you shall do no creative labor. Neither your son, neither you, your son, your daughter, manservant, maidservant, ox, your donkey, and of your livestock, nor the sojourner who is within your cities, in order that your manservant and your maidservant may rest like you. So this idea is one we saw already, that you rest on the Sabbath so that you won't be able to give work to all those who are below you in the pecking order. The manservant, the maidservant, the livestock, and the sojourner. But what I want to emphasize now is verse 15. And you shall remember, and this is for Gilda perhaps, we're getting to the slave, and you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord your God took you out from there with a strong hand and outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. We're hearing that noise again. Can everyone mute themselves? Let me see if I can mute everyone. That was it. It was Manfred. I just muted. Okay, so now we're good. So look at verse 15 again, and you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God took you out from there with a strong arm and strong hand outstretched arm. Therefore, Uh-oh. Manfred, it's you again. There, I muted you again. Okay, thank you. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Shabbat day, the Sabbath day. Therefore, the idea that we're seeing in these verses is very different than the idea we've seen in the previous verses. The previous verses were about empathy. Behave nicely towards the other because you were once in his shoes. Here in Deuteronomy chapter 25, it's a different idea. The idea here is the following. Behave nicely towards the other because God behaved nicely towards you. It's not here empathy, it's rather emulation of God. Just like God took you out of Egypt from your slavery, so you take others out of their slavery once a week. It's a microcosm of what God did. God redeemed slaves from Egypt, and you were one of those slaves. Complete redemption. You act like God and give redemption to your slaves. You don't have to do it complete like he did for you, but do it at least once a week. That, I think, the idea is the idea we find here in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Again, it's not empathy for the other. It's rather emulation of what God did for the other. And that will be expressed also in the next set of verses, Deuteronomy chapter 15. We'll read 15. If a fellow Hebrew, man or woman, is sold to you, he shall serve you 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall set him free. In other words, there's no chattel slavery. Someone who's sold into slavery only serves 6 years, then he goes free. Verse 13, when you set him free, do not let him go empty-handed. Furnish him out of the flock, threshing floor and vat, with which Lord your God has blessed you. Give him presents when he leaves. Bear in mind, the Hebrew is remember. Remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I enjoin this commandment upon you today. It's the same idea we had just earlier in the previous set of verses. It's not about empathy. It's about emulation of God. Remember that you were a slave and God redeemed you, and therefore you must redeem your slaves. When do you redeem your slaves? At the end of 6 years. So as again, it's a second usage of the memory of the period that we were in Egypt. One usage of that period is behave nicely towards the other because you were once in his shoes. And now the second idea is that we've seen in 2 places, behave nicely towards the others because God behaved nicely towards you. Emulation of God. And now let's see Deuteronomy chapter 24. You shall not subvert the rights of the sojourner or the fatherless. You shall not take a widow's garment in pawn. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, do I enjoin you to observe this commandment. Here's the third set of verses where you have that same idea of emulating God. Do not subvert the rights of the sojourner. Why? Because you remember that you were a slave, but not just you were a slave, rather that God redeemed you. And you now redeem like God redeemed. So at this point, we're finished with verses from the Torah. And I'm going to sum up in the following fashion. Excuse me. We saw 2 basic ideas. I'm simplifying. One is remembering the time you spent in Egypt, whether as a sojourner or as a slave. That should develop within us empathy for the sojourner and the slave. And therefore, you should behave properly, nicely, kindly towards the sojourner and the slave. The second idea is not about remembering that you were a sojourner slave. It's rather about remembering that you were redeemed from being a sojourner slave, and you were brought by God out of there into your own land. And just as God did that for you, you should do that for others. You should do it for the sojourner. You should do it for the slave. You should do it for the downtrodden. Because God helped the downtrodden, you should help the downtrodden. So it's a second idea. I should say it differently. It's a second mechanism for bringing us to the same behavior. So second mechanism for inspiring within us the same behavior, the behavior of proper relationship towards the other. One motivation comes from remembering that you suffered. The other motivation comes from remembering that God saved you, God redeemed you, God helped you. Okay. What do we do with all that? Everything we just learned? Well, remember I claimed at the beginning, I said at the beginning, that the Torah is full of commandments to remember that we were slaves and that we were redeemed. Furthermore, we spend the holiday of Passover focusing on the fact that we were slaves and we were redeemed. And specifically in that holiday of Passover, we have the Leil HaSeder, the Seder night, that is governed and guided by the ritual Haggadah, the ritual booklet we use to recite them that night, that talks about that we were slaves and we were redeemed. My claim is that this whole emphasis in Judaism and Judaism in general during Passover in particular, even more particular at the Seder ritual, this whole emphasis on remembering that we were slaves and we were freed is all for the purpose of what we saw right now. It's all for the purpose of inculcating within us these two different mechanisms towards teaching us to be good to other people. Which other people? The other of the other people. The people who are downtrodden, whether they're sojourners, strangers, whether they're slaves, whether they're the widow, whether they're the poor. The whole point of Passover, I would say, of this memory is to lead us towards such behavior. Again, I'll stop and see if anyone wants to comment or ask. Gilda, you're muted. I could try to unmute you.
It took God 400 years to redeem us. So what do you say about that, Rob? And we should still be thankful and good to the sojourners or those that enslaved us. It didn't take us 6 days or whatever he said.
I hear you're stumping me. I'm going to think about that.
Okay, I didn't go to. I was hoping something brilliant would come forth.
Hello?
Yes, yes.
Judy. It's me. Can you hear me? It's Judy.
I can hear you.
Yeah. Well, I think I love what I think what you're saying is so important, and that's always the theme of our Pesach here. I think if we take a big look and basically look at the narrative of the Chumash, we're moving from being nomadic people and with the goal of them settling in the land. And our forefathers, Abraham and Yitzchak and Yaakov, and that whole group were nomads, and they had cattle. And the story now, post being slaves in Mitzrayim, is that now we're preparing to set up an agrarian society in the land. So we're moving from being nomadic people to being a sedentary people. And so when you're looking at it that way, basically, and I know you know this, Rabbi Hanan, that we're really moving into trying to describe what will be a utopian society, a just society, where we will be the powerful people in the land. We're turning into farmers. And now we're trying to maintain that identity, that memory, that vicarious experience of being the stranger, which as nomadic people, we were. And if you look at it that way, I don't think you have to worry about whether we're saying we were slaves or gerim. or sojourners. I think this is just the utopian society that we're trying to blend our two identities.
Yeah, I got it. And actually, I want to focus on part of what you said in another few minutes. So, absolutely. I'm with you. Thank you. Anyone else want to comment? If there is anyone, I can't see everyone on the screen, so just speak up.
Regarding the 400 years, the Torah doesn't say we were slaves for the 400 years. So we're only slaves for part of that time, regarding Gilda's comment.
That's true, but she's right. It is more than 6 days. Yeah, okay. Thank you, Julian. I would like now to throw out a bombshell, which is the following. It's the same bombshell from two different perspectives. The first perspective is, if the Torah says 36 times in different fashions that one should behave nicely, properly towards the other, the stranger, then why don't Jews do better in that than other people? They don't. And Jews who observe the Torah don't do better in that than Jews who don't observe the Torah, as far as I can see. How could it be that such a central theme here in the Torah that Jews don't seem to uphold?
Rabbi?
Just let me finish the second part of the bombshell.
Very good.
The second perspective on the same bombshell. The second perspective on the same bombshell is that, as I stated earlier, the manual, the pamphlet that gives us the rituals of the Seder night, when we recount the story of slavery and freedom, mentions nothing of everything we said for the past 40 minutes. Nothing. How could that be? If we're claiming that the central element, the reason why we remember that we were slaves and that God redeemed us is to teach us the things we've been talking about, then why don't we mention it not even once? At the Seder that we're going to conduct this Saturday night, directed by the rituals in this Haggadah. It's not mentioned at all. And the fact that it's not mentioned at all might seem to prove that everything I said was somehow wrong. It should be the highlight of the Haggadah. It should be the highlight of the ritual. So yes, now I'm off my my bombshell. Please speak.
And Rabbi, you can be on your pulpit, your pedestal, your bombshell as much as you like, because you offer so much food for thought. And my comment to it is, your first part, you suggested that it sets forth for us a mechanism of empathy, and the second for us to emulate, so of emulation. But I find often, as humans are very proudful and complacent at the same time, that it isn't until we are embarrassed to do right that we often do. So might I suggest that often we need to be prodded in a way that shamefaced us to do the right thing. Though hopefully we will think ahead, but we don't necessarily, not till we do doubted to do so. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you for that. Indeed, it is so difficult to absorb the two mechanisms we've talked about, the empathy and the emulation. And I would like to now briefly, if possible, go over with you some of the difficulties. Well, look, the Torah says it 36 times. Apparently because it's not simple. It's very difficult, these things. It has to be said again and again and again, and it's still not said enough, and it's still, and perhaps saying it is not going to work. I just wanted to put on the table some of the psychological mechanisms that prevent us from following the advice that we've just talked about. So the first thing you see on the screen is the psychological difficulties. One of them is simply fear of the unfamiliar other. We don't know the other. He or she is different than us. We're ignorant of their body language, of their language perhaps, of their customs, the way they think. Sometimes the way they look is strange to us. And that strangeness, that ignorance, engenders fear. And we're afraid of someone, especially if there's a group of them. It's very hard to have empathy. It's very hard to emulate God's love of them. So I put on the table fear. Obviously, therefore, the Torah is trying to help us overcome that fear. But that fear is a very, very fundamental psychological mechanism. It's not so easy to overcome. Point number 2, trauma. The psychologists among us will tell us that wounded people wound people. We know that very often people who commit crimes of sexual abuse, people who commit crimes of violence against their children, are those people who've suffered from those same things as children. We repeat the evil that's been done to us. We pass it on. We pass it forward. That's not good. It's not right. But that's the nature of the human soul. That's trauma. And in this context, it's not just that the Jewish people were traumatized by being the other in Egypt. It's not just we were traumatized by being slaves in Egypt. We're traumatized again and again and again throughout Jewish history, whether it's the destruction of the first Jewish Commonwealth, destruction of the second Jewish Commonwealth, the failure of the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 135 of the Common Era, whether it's pogroms and anti-Semitism and exile from countries in Europe, whether it's the Helsinki massacres or whether it's the Holocaust. The Jewish people are a wounded people, a traumatized people. And despite all the nice things the Torah said, it looks like the Torah hasn't helped us to overcome that trauma. Wounded people wound people. And when I say wounded people wound people, there's kind of there's a double meaning there. Wounded people in the sense of wounded individuals, but also wounded people in the sense of the Jewish people. The Jewish people are a wounded people. And we end up passing that wound on. The third point on the screen is the victim mentality. It happens that those who have suffered come out of their suffering with a sense of, in Hebrew we say, magia li. I'm a victim, therefore I'm not going to take responsibility. I deserve to have others now serve me, others help me, others look after me, others give me what I deserve because I didn't get it for so long. So often victims have a sense that they don't have to take responsibility. They don't have to go the extra yard to help the other, to help the stranger, because we suffered so much. Now it's our turn to be treated nicely. Why should we have to take the effort to treat others nicely? Look what they did to us. And we tend to look at the others around us. We tend to blend them into the others that did to us what was done to us. We don't have the strength, there's the fortitude to take the responsibility to behave differently. And again, the Torah could talk to us until it's blue in the face, and it does, but it doesn't help. There's these three factors we have on the board here, on the screen here, the psychological mechanisms that seem to be stronger than what the Torah is trying to tell us. And then there's vengeance, of course. We want to take revenge. We want to get back at those who did to us what was done to us. And like I said just 2 minutes ago, sometimes we paint all the others in this with the same brush. The others did something to us, so all the others deserve to be paid back. Doesn't matter. We see all the others as a mass that are all the same. And the fifth thing I have on the screen is the Stockholm syndrome. This may be a misnomer, but look at what I mean: identification with or desire to emulate the oppressor. So often it happens. It's another psychological mechanism that those who've suffered from power, from oppression, well, they begin to envy that power, to look up to that power, to respect that power. Look how powerful these people were to do what they did to us. So we want that power also. We want to be able to do what was done to us. And then what so often happens is the victim, the wounded, when they now have power, they do exactly what was done to them. Because they've come to have great respect for power, even for unjust use of power. So that's why the Torah had to say 36 times to behave nicely towards the stranger, but 36 times looks like it's not enough. In addition to all that, there's also the theological difficulties that Jewish people have in observing this commandment of behaving nicely and properly towards the stranger. And I put here 4 different theological issues that Jewish people have. I'll just have to do them briefly. There's so much to say about each of them. We have an image of ourselves of a people that dwells alone. That's a quote from a half of a verse in the book of Numbers. Am levadad yishkon. And we very often don't want to take into account others. We don't want them around us. We don't want to think about them. We think about ourselves as separate, as different. Certainly here in Israel, there's a sense that Israel is just for Jews. Anyone who's not like us, well, they're getting involved in something that's not theirs. We don't want them. We're not concerned with them. We don't want them on our radar screen. We don't want to see them. A second point, of course, is the chosen people. Am nivchar. Theologically, among Jewish thinkers, it's not about privilege. It's not about rights. The opposite is about responsibility. But so many times it's been abused, and it's still abused. People think chosen people means that we are privileged, and the others, they don't deserve what we have. We don't have to think about them. They are perhaps even inferior to us. The chosen people is often understood as a matter of superiority. I would say it's misunderstood, but I can't deny the fact that many people, including rabbis, understand it as a certain type of spiritual superiority. And that's a theological factor that makes it very difficult to respect and love the other, the stranger. Thirdly, there's the Amalek phenomena. We have a concept in Judaism, and again, on each of these things, we could talk for hours. Amalek is the idea of absolute evil, that we must demonize absolute evil. We must come out against it. We must hate it. We must fight it. But as far as I'm concerned, it becomes a slippery slope in which it's convenient to demonize all those that are different than us, or some of them that are different than us, to see only the bad and the evil and the negative in the other. And then we say, yes, there's a commandment to love the stranger, but not them. And also not them. And also not them either, because they're all Amalek. They're all representatives of absolute evil. And it's even, some would say it's immoral to love the other who is Amalek, who's a demon, who's dangerous. And that slippery slope allows us to almost completely wipe out the commandment to love the other, to have compassion for the other. Another point I'm putting on the screen is theo-historical determinism. Jewish suffering at the hands of the Gentiles is part of the divine plan. Many Jews and many rabbis believe that that's the way God designed the universe, that we suffer at the hands of the Gentiles. So it's supposed to be like that. It's a them and us. It's only them and us. It's always them and us. And it's always a matter of opposition. It's always a matter of conflict. It's always a matter of animosity. That animosity is supposed to be there. And who are we to chafe against the divine plan? How can we love the other when actually they're supposed to hate us? And since they're supposed to hate us, we're supposed to hate them. That's the way God wanted it. That's the way the universe is designed. Or at least that's the way Jewish history is designed. So those are 4 theological reasons that stand in tension to everything we talked about the relationship to the other, to the stranger. And now I get to the social political difficulty with love of the stranger. And here I'm not trying to explain only why we Jews are not better than any others in loving the stranger, but I'm specifically trying to explain why in the Haggadah, why in this manual of the rituals of Passover, is there no mention of love of the stranger? And here, I'm going to sit back for a second and try and say this very clearly. The picture that the Torah gives us, and this goes back to what Judy said earlier, is that we are moving, that when we are redeemed from Egyptian slavery, we are going from exile to home. We're going to our land, the land of Israel. In the land of Israel, we will have power, we will have sovereignty, we will have us as the majority culture, religion, ethnic group, society, and there will be an other in our midst. And that other in our midst will be lacking political power, will be lacking land, will be lacking the means of making a livelihood, will be a minority. And the Torah told us in those 36 places that we saw some of them, that we, as the group in power in our state and land of Israel, must know how to behave properly and nicely and kindly towards the minority that is given over to our behavior. They're at our mercy as a minority. What happened is that for at least the past 2,000 years, the Jewish people were unable to fulfill these commandments in the Torah about proper behavior towards the other because we were the other. That's the point. The Torah envisions a situation in which we are not the other, we are the mainstream, we are the minority, we are in power. And we're being told that when in the position of power, behave properly towards those without power. But the problem is that for the past 2,000 years, we couldn't behave properly towards the other because we were the other. We didn't have the power. We were too busy surviving. We were the other that should have been behaved towards nicely by the majority. And this book, this pamphlet, was written over the course of the past 2,000 years. It comes out of and describes a reality in which we cannot fulfill the commandments of the Torah because we don't have the social political reality that Torah envisions for the fulfillment of its commandments of behaving properly towards the stranger. So what I tried to explain, just to sum up briefly, and then again, we'll open the floor. I tried to explain two things. I tried to explain why it's so difficult to behave properly towards the stranger with psychological reasoning and theological reasoning. And secondly, I tried to explain why we Jews don't even try to behave properly towards the stranger, why we don't, even during the Passover celebration that should be all about reminding ourselves that we were slaves and we were redeemed to teach us how to behave properly towards strangers. We don't talk about that at all, because when this pamphlet was written, it wasn't on the agenda. What I would add, what I'm trying to say is that those who wrote this pamphlet understood that all the beautiful things the Torah says about how we should behave towards the stranger, all those things are put on ice. They're put on hold until the day will come when we do have this social political reality in which those commandments are relevant. But they weren't relevant when this book was written. And therefore, and I'm going to say something new, therefore, to a certain degree, this book is no longer relevant, because today we live in a different social political reality. Today, we finally, after 2,000 years, we Jews live in a social political reality in which we have power. We have political power, we have social power, we have social status and prestige. We are no longer the other. For 2,000 years, we were the other. We're no longer the other. And it's finally time. The groundwork is in place that Jews today should be able to go back to the Torah and try to begin implementing what the Torah says. And when I say that today we have social and political power, I mean both in Israel and in America. In Israel, we are the government. We are the political and social power. In America, we're a minority, but we are no longer the other. We have a degree of respect. We have a degree of power. We have a degree of clout. And it's time, not just in Israel, but in America, I would say, for Jews to begin to appreciate the power that we have, to stop looking at ourselves as the other, as the minority, as the downtrodden, as the sufferer, as the victim, and to begin to take responsibility. The Torah is all about taking responsibility on the two levels we talked about. The responsibility of empathy and the responsibility of emulation of God's redemption. But again, this book, this Haggadah, doesn't go in that direction at all, because it wasn't relevant for the Jewish people when it was written. It's time to rewrite this book, because social political reality is different. And we have to, I would say, add into the Haggadah, add into Pesach, add into Passover, the elements of the Torah that have been put on ice for the past 2,000 years. So again, I open it up to comments and questions. Objections?
Rabbi?
Yes.
Question, as such, and what you say makes so much sense. As such, if we adhere to the Haggadah as it is and not interpolate or inject things that are more current and would contribute to more thoughtfulness, this perpetuates a lot of the negative reactions on our part. Is that what you are suggesting?
Yes.
Thank you. It's Margot. Thank you.
And I see that Teresa wants to say something, and I'll immediately I'll just answer Margot. So just wait a few seconds. When I made this presentation last year, and I made the exact same presentation last year, until this point, I think I more or less repeated what I said last year. In the last 20 minutes of last year's presentation, I made some vague suggestions of how to change the Haggadah, how to change the text. This year, in the last 20 minutes, I want to make not vague suggestions, I want to make specific suggestions. I actually went over the Haggadah and I rewrote it. I'm exaggerating. I made some small rewrites, and I'd like to present them to you after we hear from Teresa. Teresa.
I'm interested in purchasing a book, that particular book that you recommend that I read or that we read for Passover. And how would I do that? Do I, send a payment with address? I'm in Olympia, Washington, Western Washington in America.
So you know what? Let's wait till the very end. If you can wait till the end, stay on with me.
Okay.
And then I'll try to think about what you're asking.
Okay.
Colleen also wants to say something. Colleen?
I've just been listening. I know you and I've had these conversations for some time, Hanan. My heart, my hand is on my heart. I'm just so full of gratefulness. Tenderness too, because I've never walked the Jewish path. I come from a Christian background. And I visited you 4 years ago, and I came away with that question: what is the power of the Jewish people to shape a world? And I'm just so grateful. I have no idea of the tenderness of your hearts and your plight, but thank you for teaching me something that I wish my own faith would do, to move away from the privileged elitism and to be with humanity as we are called to serve. So thank you, Hanan. It's just precious, and you touched me immensely today.
Thank you. So I'm going to share my screen with a different document. I'm going to share my screen with the Haggadah text. Okay, share screen. Wait a second, guys. This is hard for me. Here we go. Okay, very good. What I put on the screen, from a Passover of alienation to a Passover of empathy, some small suggestions to improve the text of the Haggadah in light of the things we talked about. I say in light of the Torah, in light of what the Torah asks of us. So at the very beginning of the Haggadah, there's a passage that's in Aramaic called Ha Lachma Anya, which means this is the bread of affliction. In many homes, we actually pass the matzah, the unleavened bread, around, and each person puts it on their shoulder in turn and says a few sentences in Aramaic. In the English translation of what we say, it goes like this: this is the bread of affliction, referring to the matzah, the unleavened bread, that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Anyone who is hungry may come and eat. Anyone who is in need may come and partake of the Passover meal. Now we are here. Next year we will be in the land of Israel. This year we are slaves. Next year we will be free people. That's the end of what it says in the text as we know it today. I think the time has come to eliminate those words that I put in blue, and I'll explain why. In blue, it says, now we are here. Next year we'll be in the land of Israel. This year we are slaves. Next year we'll be free people. As far as I understand it, those two phrases, those two sentences are actually a statement. They're a terrible statement. They're a statement that we cannot fulfill what the Torah wants of us because the time hasn't come. They're a statement that despite the fact that God took us from slavery to freedom, we're still slaves. God's plan didn't fulfill itself. He took us from slavery to freedom, but now we're back as slaves. We're slaves to the Muslims. We're slaves to the Christians. We're slaves to the English state that is persecuting us, to the French state, to the Spanish state that exiled us, to Chmelnytsky, to the Nazis. We're still slaves. We're still suffering. Next year we'll be free people. Next year we'll be able to fulfill the commandment of the Torah as free people. We won't be the other anymore. We'll be able to behave properly towards the other, but not yet. This year we can't do it yet. This year we're not yet in the land of Israel. We don't yet have the power. We're still where we're not supposed to be. We're not ready to fulfill the commandments of the Torah because we're the other. We can't behave properly towards the other because we're the other. We Jews have been saying that for 2,000 years, and it was true. but it's not true anymore. And the fact that we're still saying it today is a means, an unconscious means of abdicating responsibility. Yeah. We have to admit that we do have power. We have power in America, we have power in Israel, and it's time to take responsibility for that power. And I'm so afraid that those words I put in blue are, again, a mechanism that's allowing us to unconsciously abdicate our responsibility. It's as if we're saying at the beginning of the Seder, the beginning of the ceremony, this isn't for real. We don't have to yet apply what it's really about because we're still in limbo, we're still in exile, we're still being persecuted. I don't deny that Jews were persecuted. I don't deny that in some places Jews are persecuted. But today we do have power and it's time to take responsibility. And therefore, I suggest to replace the words I put in blue with the words I put in red. Now, it's just a suggestion. Everyone could go in their own direction.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I've been very active in Gaza. Not in Gaza, but online in Gaza since the 2014 war. And they are hostages. My friends are hostages. They do not have civil liberties. One friend who I helped a tremendous amount and his family has had his whole family tortured when Hamas came to power. I have all the documentation. And I have evidence that they sacrificed the lives of their own children because I met the older brother of a 2-year-old child that was found in the rubble of a house that Hamas curfewed the family there during the 2014 war. I just don't understand this conversation in context with that. I can't measure them against each other because it's so blatant what I've experienced in contact with these people over a period of years. Ahmed Abu Artema also. Do you know who Ahmed Abu Artema is? He was the originator of the March of Return idea. And I brought him into a group with Israeli activists, Myron Joshua and Emmanuel Shahaf and Inan Kahati and Meron Rappaport. We had a group together during the demonstrations. And then they left, and there was a lot of good interaction, and Abu Artema and his colleague left. And then when I saw what was unfolding at the fence, which is like, your snipers shooting off the legs of people, who they say were acting in consort with extremists to sabotage the fence and allow infiltrators to attack, Jewish communities in close vicinity. That was the whole scenario. And I was going every week to a journalist who was filming live called Walid Mahmoud, a journalist in Gaza. I was watching his feed. When I saw these kids getting shot, I put together a petition demanding that the IDF live stream the demonstrations into the UN Security Council. Abu Artema signed that petition. But when I asked him if he could meet with Israeli activists at the fence, he balked. He was not able to do a live meeting.
Okay, so you're saying some.
And you know the story of Rami. Just to finish, Rami Aman.
Yes, I do.
I'm very close friends with Rami Aman. Okay, yeah.
I'd be happy to leave this to the end. You are talking about the application and the difficulties of the application of the things that we're talking about.
Yes.
So it's very important to bring this up, but I do want to finish the
Go ahead. I'm sorry that it took so long.
So I'd like to read the words that I wrote in red. Now we live in suspicion and alienation. Next year, may we learn trust and empathy. This year, we have not yet treated the stranger with the respect that the Torah teaches. Next year, may we love the stranger as ourselves. I'm not sure that that's the right replacement for what I'd like to remove from the text. And again, I think it's open to everyone's interpretation, what might be right for you. But I did want to point out again that the words in blue, I think, have now become an obstacle. Have become an obstacle. Okay. The text goes on for pages and pages and pages. I didn't copy it. But then a later point, much further on in the Haggadah, we say the following. I'm reading what's on the screen. I'm putting my cursor where I'm reading. Blessed be the one who keeps his promise to Israel. The reference, of course, is to God. Blessed be he. Since the Holy One, blessed be he, calculated the end of the exile to do as he said to Abraham, our father, in the covenant between the pieces, as it's stated in Genesis 15. And then the text of the ritual quotes, and we all say this around our table at the Seder. And he said to Avram, Avram is Abraham before his name was changed. God said to Abraham, you should surely know that your seed will be a stranger in a land that is not theirs. And they will enslave them and inflict them 400 years, right? That's the prediction of the period of slavery in Egypt. We went down as strangers and then we became slaves. And also that nation for which they shall toil will I judge. God said he will judge the Egyptians. And afterwards they will go out with much property. So it's again, a prediction here of the Exodus. Now that passage that our Haggadah text is quoting, the text from Genesis, actually has two more sentences to it. And our Haggadah text doesn't quote those two further sentences. And my position is, my claim is, that the omission of those two sentences is related to some of the things we've talked about tonight, today, for some of you, and that it's proper in our generation to add back in, I should say that differently, to add in those two sentences that are the natural continuation of that passage from Genesis. The missing two sentences are, God continues the prophecy and says to Avram, to Abraham, and as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, you shall be buried in a ripe old age. That's not important, but what's important is next verse. And they, meaning the Israelites, shall return here, meaning the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, in the fourth generation. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. In other words, the prophecy of our period of being a sojourner and then being a slave in Egypt, that prophecy continues with the Exodus that brings us to the land of Israel. That was left out of the traditional Haggadah text. I think it's clear why it was left out, because it wasn't relevant for Jews in exile for the past 2,000 years. They hadn't come back to their land. They didn't live in their land. But today, my claim is that when Jews are living in the land of Israel, we should make it clear that the purpose of the Exodus was to bring us back to our land. Why is that important to me? Not just because it's true that that was the purpose and that I am living back in the land today, but because emphasis of the fact that the Exodus's purpose was to bring us back to the land brings us to the concept of sovereignty, of political power, of being a majority nation in your own land, which is the foundation for taking responsibility that we talked about for the past hour and a half. If we leave out the idea that the Jews are coming back to the land, we're leaving out responsibility. We're leaving out the sense that today we have the political and social power to do what the Torah says, to behave properly towards our minorities, because the minorities are our minorities. They're not someone else's minorities, they're our minorities. So I think it's proper to have that verse quoted. And it's also important to emphasize, but actually we don't have time for it, so I'll leave it out, why it's important to emphasize the last few words. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet completed. Leave that for next year. Right after the text quotes this passage from Genesis, it brings the words that I have in blue as we go down on the screen where my cursor is. And I humbly submit that those words in blue are extremely counterproductive for everything we've talked about for the past hour and a half. And that's an understatement. What the words in blue say is as follows: and it is this that has stood for our ancestors and for us, since it is not only one person or nation that has stood against us to destroy us, but rather in each generation they stand against us to destroy us. But the Holy One, blessed be he, rescues us from their hand. What that passage is saying when it says, and it is this, that this refers to the previous passage from Genesis. And it is implying an interpretation that when God said to Abraham, your seed will be a stranger in a land that's not theirs, and they'll be enslaved, it's implying that that wasn't a one-time prophecy. It's something that's going to repeat it again and again in Jewish history, as if there's here a prophecy that we will be afflicted again and again and again, we'll be persecuted again and again and again. And that God promises to judge those who afflict us, to punish those who afflict us, to redeem us again and again and again. Not just a one-time affair, but throughout history, we will be enslaved. We will be persecuted. What's happening here is that on the one hand, it's true. It's true. We were persecuted again and again and again. It's not a lie. It's not false. But I believe that by emphasizing at the Passover Seder ceremony that we were and we are and will continue to be persecuted again and again and again, we are putting ourselves in the position of a victim. And we're saying that we have no power. We're not in charge. We're the other. And it's a way, again, of unconsciously shirking responsibility. It's a way of saying, we've not yet reached land of Israel. We've not yet reached power. We've not yet reached sovereignty. We've not yet reached responsibility. If anyone's responsibility, it's the Goyim, it's the other nations that are always coming against us. And we are just sheep going to the slaughter. What can we do? The whole world is against us. This passage I put in blue because in what I prepared, blue means to omit the passage. I think that passage is historically true, but it doesn't belong in the Haggadah. The Haggadah, at least today, when the Jewish people do have social and political power, the Haggadah should be about admitting that power, about taking responsibility for that power, and looking not at ourselves as persecuted others, but trying to see if though the minorities around us may be persecuted by us. We have to take responsibility for having power, having sovereignty. This passage is very dangerous for that. Not only is it not about taking responsibility, it's about shirking responsibility, saying we're the victim, we're the wounded, we're those who are suffering. Don't look at us for taking responsibility. And I have to tell you that this passage that I put in blue here is at the center of the Israeli mentality. This passage has been put to music. There are 3 or 4 beautiful tunes. They're on the radio before Passover all the time here in Israel. It's time to take responsibility and stop being a victim. This passage has to leave the Haggadah. As beautiful as the tune is that we sing it to, we should hum it, but not say this passage. Now, I'm aware of the fact that we've run out of time. And I'm aware of the fact that there are like 31 people on the call now. There may be only 10 in another 1 minute, and that's okay. I'm going to go on for anyone who wants to continue with us. And I apologize if you have to leave and you feel that you're missing part of it. It'll be recorded. So I'm going to go on. The next paragraph, unfortunately, I didn't print it for you here. I just wrote skip all to the next paragraph. The next paragraph in the Haggadah text is about Lavan. Lavan was the father-in-law in the book of Genesis of Jacob. And that paragraph claims that it's not just that since the Egyptians persecuted the Jews, we've been persecuted again and again since then, but rather Lavan was the one that began to persecute us. He persecuted Jacob. And that was a paradigm for the way the Egyptians persecuted the Israelites, and it's a paradigm for the way all the anti-Semites persecute us in every generation. That paragraph about Lavan is based on a creative misreading of a certain verse in the book of Deuteronomy that's about to be quoted here from Deuteronomy 26. And I would claim that that paragraph and that misinterpretation should be deleted from the Haggadah, because it's just like the previous paragraph. It's just about shirking responsibility and looking at ourselves only as the persecuted victim, which prevents us from taking responsibility for how we might have to behave better towards the others in our midst. So you know what? I changed my mind. I will make this text of the my emendated text of the Haggadah available to anyone who wants it. Just send me an email and I'll send it to you. And actually, it's been sent to you already. Rachel sent it all to all already. You can look at it. You can email me and ask me questions. I shouldn't spend time just going over all the details. Perhaps at the end, I should say that the text of the Haggadah, most of it, is not the Bible. It's not the Talmud. It's not a text that there's a Jewish obligation to say exactly as it's written. It's one that is certainly, according to Jewish law, one that can be changed, most of it. And as you heard, I believe not only that it can be changed, I believe that some of it ought to be changed in order to be more loyal, actually, to what the Torah wants of us concerning this holiday of Passover, concerning what the Torah wants of us as far as taking responsibility towards the other in our midst. How should we end? I'll tell you that I've written about this. Those who want to see what I've written about it can go to my website, not to the Friends of Roots website, but to my own website, which is ravchanan.org. Put that in the chat if I can, ravchanan.org. And there in the chat, there in the, on my website, there's a section of blog posts. And the two blog posts that deal with what we talked about here, one of them is called, believe it or not, From a Passover of Alienation to a Passover of Empathy. Can't forget that. That was the title for today. There's a blog post about that. And the other blog post is called Passover and Palestinians. Passover and Palestinians, in which I explained that, in my opinion, Israel has, in a certain sense, enslaved the Palestinians. And I think the text of the Haggadah is one of the many, 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 many factors that allow us to continue to do that and not see what we're doing. And part of the suggestions that I made in changing the Haggadah are about a change in Jewish-Israeli mentality, self-understanding. It's about a transformation that is founded upon seeing us for who we are. We are in power. We have sovereignty. We have control. And it's time to exercise that control in a fashion consistent with what the Torah talks about. I'd like Passover to stop being a means for blinding ourselves to our power and begin to become part of a process of opening our eyes to our power and how we can do better in exercising that power. Okay, so I said a lot, and now I'm, anyone who'd like to speak, I'm certainly open to listening and engaging.
I have a comment, Hanan.
Richard.
This is Richard Rosenfield from Ithaca, New York. I love what you're doing. I love the changes that you're suggesting to the Haggadah. I'm thinking that a lot of Jewish law that we find in the Talmud perhaps can be updated to recognize the fact that Israel is a presence in the world today. There is a land for the Jewish people. But I disagree in some respects about some of the things that you want to remove from the Haggadah, because I do believe that there is an element of slavery that the Israelis are inflicting upon themselves. If you're not making peace with the people who live in the land, then you have to erect walls, and you have to have checkpoints, and you have to secure yourself, because you are not free. And I think an element of becoming free is making it free for all who live in the land. And that's going to take a lot of effort on both sides.
I agree. I agree. Thank you, Richard.
So can I ask a question?
Yes.
Well, first of all, I really enjoyed the presentation. It was fascinating, and I really appreciate the honesty and integrity with which you approached the text, as far as I can tell. So I'm really grateful to have been a part of this and be present. I'm curious about, I guess, one thing. You mentioned the theological difficulties, and those, I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me. I'm wondering about something else too, and I just wanted to mention it and be really interested in whatever reaction you have. So in the Torah, I mean, we have all the passages that you mentioned that talk about, loving the stranger, remembering that the Israelites were strangers and the sojourners in the land of Egypt, and remembering that God freed the Israelites from slavery and so forth. But there are also texts. Part of the story too is that as the children of Israel moved from Egypt to the Promised Land, that they were given commands to drive out people who were there, and to drive them out, dispossess them, at times even destroy them. And I'm wondering, there seems to be a tension between that and some of the passages we read today. And I'm wondering, what Jewish tradition, if it recognized that and how it dealt with that, and if that poses a theological difficulty at all. I mean, any thoughts you have about that, I'd be interested in.
So that's a very, very, very big subject, Andrew, and a very important subject. And you're absolutely right that it's directly related here. So I only have 3 hours to answer your question, then I have to go to sleep. But I'll say the following. In a spiritual or philosophical or ideological sense, there's a deep tension, as you said, between the things we talked about and the verses about expelling and exterminating the Canaanites. You're absolutely right. But on the level of Jewish law and the level of the technical fulfillment of the things, there actually is no contradiction. Because what I mean to say, there's no contradiction for us as modern people. Because both the Torah and later Jewish law make it very clear that those commandments of extermination of the Canaanites were only for those particular Canaanite nations. And the Talmud, Jewish law, says explicitly and clearly those nations do not exist anymore. So just to repeat what I said, your point is very important on the philosophical and spiritual and ideological level, but on the practical level, there's no commandments in the Torah that contradict what we talked about today, because all those matters of extermination of the Canaanites are clearly understood to be time-bound. And the time is beyond us. The time is behind us.
I beg to differ, Rabbi. After my experience speaking intimately with Gazans who confided in me about their experiences, I think we're dealing with very vicious people. And I don't apply that term to all Palestinians, but I certainly do to the leaders who are oppressing them in Gaza. They are vicious folk. I don't know if I agree with your assessment, whether they are descendants of the people that we were called on to annihilate is a question to be answered. But I'll tell you that when you sacrifice a 2-year-old child the life of a 2-year-old child, when you know that the Israelis are going to bomb a certain place, there isn't a more heinous crime possible for a human being. Sacrifice his own child.
Okay, that may be true and it's very important, but it's not related to what I was saying to Andrew. I was just talking the level of technical religious responsibility. That all the commandments exterminating the Canaanites, according to all authorities, just don't exist today. They're not relevant, they're not applicable.
How are you going to pick apart from all the good people that seek peace, who are oppressed by this mafia? How are you going to redeem them?
I'm not clear what you're asking. How to redeem?
They don't have freedom of speech. My friend Rami Aman, if you've noticed, since he was released from prison, he's not on his wall starting up full blast his youth committee activities. He's laying low because he's in danger if he tries to do more communicating with Israelis. So for me, this is the fulcrum of the conflict. You know, if people aren't able to communicate with one another, how do you intend to make peace with one another? These people are being denied the opportunity to speak with you.
True. But it's not clear to me how that...
You consider Gaza part of the land in your vision of the land.
Yes, I do.
So then it is your responsibility to resolve this crisis.
My responsibility to resolve which crisis?
The crisis of the hostage crisis of people who don't have civil liberties in Gaza. People who are not able to be here with us speaking openly in a Zoom meeting because they'll face incarceration.
I agree like you that the Hamas government is very evil towards its people.
May I interrupt? Yeah. Sorry, Stephen, but I wanted to ask you about, I wanted to know more about what you mean when you say that, when you mentioned that there is a sort of mafia controlling Palestinian lives. I just wanted to ask you, what entity exactly are you talking about? Are you talking about Palestinians in general? Are you talking about Fatah, Hamas? You know,
I'm talking about Hamas, and I'm talking about, in certain cases, I'm talking about specific actors within Hamas. I was told that it wasn't a general policy to curfew civilians to sacrifice their lives during the 2014 war, but that there were individual actors who did do those types of actions, hold people in places where Israel was going to bomb. And people died because of it. And I met the older brother of a 2-year-old baby who was killed that way. I met him in a group in Gaza. They were a group of Gazan civilians who were at a Hamas camp, and there were a lot of Israelis and Jews from all over the world with these kids speaking with them.
All right. Okay. Of course, I'm not going to be the devil's advocate here. I'm a Palestinian, right? I'm a Palestinian living in the West Bank, Nablus, Shechem, and of course, you have different sorts of people, very different sorts of people in Palestine, and they all belong to many different political entities and political worldviews, of course, and of course, a lot, if not most, Palestinians do not want Hamas to be in control, do not like the policies, and do agree that they are doing a lot of bad things to the people who are living in Gaza, and that their policies are leading them towards chaos in Gaza Strip. But at the same time, you have to look at the bigger picture here, Stephen, and you have to see that.
I know the bigger picture. Excuse me, wait a minute. Don't assume that I don't know the bigger picture. As far as I'm concerned, Israeli government is complicit in the sacrifice of these children's lives because they know that they curfew their children and Israel bombs them. This is not a solution. I spent the whole summer of 2014 advocating for them, for Israel to open a border, for them to be able to flee. I have done nothing but try to save these people's lives, your people's lives, who are in Gaza, and I hold Israel responsible for this. You really want to know what I think?
I do agree with you that that what Hamas has done is very unacceptable and inhumane towards those kids. And I'm not saying that I am with the policies of Hamas, of course, but I'm just saying that all of these has been sort of obligatory, because if you look at people in Gaza, they have been, as you said, I mean, I'm with you in the idea that they are trapped and they need to open up, people in Gaza, and because Hamas is in control over there, they are doing whatever they can, whatever they want. I mean, with the when it comes to policies and how to deal with Israelis, they are taking the route of armed resistance, and for them, they see that this is the only way for them to have their own rights again. And because they are in control of policy in Gaza, all the people in Gaza have to suffer the consequences. And I do agree with you on that. But what I was trying to say is that this is because of the bigger picture. This is because all Palestinians right now are the other, as Hanan has talked about the concept of the other. But right now we are being the other, and we have been what is the word? Sorry, my English is not, because it's not my first language, but we have a lot of us has been oppressed, like first-hand oppressed, and or 90% of us, I would say, that have dealt with oppression or know a close one who has been prosecuted, killed, or so.
It is not in your interests for the people of Gaza not to have civil liberties, to be able to speak with Israelis on the ground. Because that, if Gazans are free to speak to Israelis and don't face incarceration, relationships that have already been established between them can become stronger, and you'll have a stronger civil rights movement for your people if you will have, if there will be this communication established. So it's in everybody's best interest to incarcerate criminals who sacrifice the lives of their own people. That's my point of view. You strike at the weak link in this criminal operation. I don't exonerate the Israeli government. I'm not trying to say anything like that. I believe in a single dual parliamentary state. It's called the supranational federation, dual parliamentary single state with its two separate parliaments, equal rights, equal distribution of resources. Politically, I believe in one country with equality. There's different political paradigms, political models that could work. But in the meantime, you have this mafia controlling the civilian population, and this needs to be dealt with. Now, there's different choices of how to go about doing that. That's what I'm interested in the question. The question is to ask, what choices do you think are available here?
I mostly agree with you on the parts that that people have to sit and talk and agree on having equal outcomes, having equal rights.
Yeah, but they can't sit and talk. He can't. Rami was arrested.
Stephen, we've gotten off subject. It's a very important subject, but it still is a different subject. I want to go back to our subject.
Okay.
We're finished. But Teresa asked me a question earlier, and I think she's been waiting patiently. So, Teresa, you asked for books about.
Well, I was on your website on my cell phone. So I'm Christian, and I want to, and I do calligraphy. So I'm always looking for ways to honor the Jewish faith and the Palestinian faith in a manner of peace and helping me to have understanding. So I show respect as a believer in God and you know, my faith, and just do it in a way that gives honor and creates peace through the arts. And so I don't even know what to ask. I just want to learn more. That's all. I don't know what information I need. I just want to learn more.
So if you're interested in general in the Passover rituals of the Jewish people,
yes,
I could recommend, there's a book about Passover, or about the Passover Haggadah, the Passover ritual, by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs.
Okay. Okay.
And another book I could recommend is a book called The Jewish Way, The Jewish Way, by Rabbi Irving Greenberg. And that's about all the Jewish holidays, including Passover.
Okay.
But there's thousands of books. My recommendation is not more important than anyone else's recommendation.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions?
I don't know if I've only heard my former husband, his last name was Gomorrah, and there was a synagogue that was right in my area in San Diego, and he did this thing where he went around and tried finding the lost Jews. And so he said the pronunciation was Hamora and not Gomorrah. And then he sat down and talked with us. And so my former husband, he passed away. And I have these adult children that have the name Gomorrah. And as Christians, they were bullied in vacation Bible schools and Sunday school, because they would always say, oh, you're descendants of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then my mother-in-law and her sisters would tell these stories, and they were originally from Spain. And so I've done a lot of my own personal research to help my children's self-esteem. They're all now adults. They're in their 20s and late 20s and late 30s, but in my amateur way, I just did what I could do to help them to have honor of their heritage.
Yeah.
So anything that you recommend, I would appreciate.
Well, start with the two books that I mentioned.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else want to add or comment or question? I guess not. So for those of you who are left, I'll say thank you for joining us. For those of you who are Jewish, I'll say have a happy Passover. For those of you celebrating Easter, I'll say have a happy Easter.
Thank you.
Good day.
Happy Passover.
Thank you. Bye.